My boss stole my designs for years, then fired me, but the Fashion Week finale left her speechless. The moment I knew everything was about to change wasn't when Georgia fired me. It wasn't when I discovered the secret sales of my designs to competitors. It wasn't even when I found the emails proving years of theft. It was when I stood in the back of the crowded auditorium at New York Fashion Week, watching Georgia Hall strut onto the stage in her signature white pantsuit, red-soled heels clicking against the hardwood as she basked in a standing ovation for a collection I had designed every stitch of. The inspiration came to me during a retreat in Santorini. She purred into the microphone, her diamond bracelets catching the spotlight as she gestured dramatically. The way the sunset hit the whitewashed buildings, I just knew I had to capture that gradient in fabric. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. That inspiration had come to me while I was stuck in a 7-hour flight delay at JFK. Sketching frantically on napkins as Georgia texted me every 20 minutes demanding updates. I hadn't been to Santorini. I'd never even left the country. But Georgia had on the company dime. Researching while I worked 18-hour days bringing my visions to life. A fashion journalist in the front row raised her hand. Georgia. The handbag line is revolutionary, the asymmetrical closures paired with sustainable materials. What sparked that innovation? Georgia's smile widened, practiced and perfect. Sometimes genius strikes at 3 a.m., darling. That's why I keep a sketch pad by my bed. I almost laughed out loud. That 3 a.m. genius had actually struck me in the office bathroom after a 16-hour workday when I was too exhausted to drive home. I'd been washing my face when the design concept hit me. And I'd sketched it on toilet paper because Georgia had taken my notebook for a review. As the crowd applauded again, I slipped out the back door. 3 years I'd spent as Georgia Hall's design assistant, watching her claim my work as her own. 3 years of being told I should be grateful for the exposure and learning experience. 3 years of believing her when she said I wasn't ready to have my name on anything yet. But that night, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was done. My name is Lindsay Kidman. I'm 29 years old. And this is the story of how I took back what was mine from the woman fashion magazines called the visionary designer of our generation, but who couldn't sketch a straight line if her life depended on it. And trust me, by the end of this story, it kind of did. I met Georgia Hall 4 years ago at a design showcase at Parsons. I was presenting my senior collection minimalist streetwear with architectural details that had earned me top marks but little industry attention. The big fashion houses weren't looking for Asian American kids from Queens with student loan debt. They wanted European trust fund babies who could afford to work for free and had connections to celebrities. Georgia swooped in wearing a cape, an actual cape, in July, indoors. Her platinum blonde hair was cut in a severe bob that looked like it cost more than my rent, and she carried a crocodile handbag that definitely violated several international laws. "You," she said, pointing a crimson fingernail at my display. "This is interesting. Not quite there yet, but interesting." I didn't know who she was, a major sin in the fashion world. When she handed me her business card, matte black, with raised gold lettering, of course, I tried not to visibly react to the name. Georgia Hall designs had been featured in Vogue 3 times that year. She'd dressed A-listers for the Met Gala. She was 42 and already a legend. "I need an assistant with fresh eyes," she said, examining her reflection in a nearby mirror rather than looking at me. "Someone not yet corrupted by industry nonsense. You start Monday. My office will email details." She swept away before I could even respond. Later. I would recognize this as classic Georgia making decisions for others, assuming compliance, believing her selections were honors bestowed rather than jobs offered. But back then I was ecstatic. This was my big break. The first 6 months were a dream. Georgia's Soho studio was everything I'd imagined: exposed brick, enormous windows, dress forms draped in luxurious fabrics, and assistants scurrying around like perfectly dressed ants. Georgia would sweep in around 11 a.m., sunglasses on regardless of the weather, green smoothie in hand, and declare the day's focus. Textures. Everyone, I'm feeling textures today. Something Unexpected, rough against smooth. Like life, she'd announce dramatically before disappearing into her office. I'd work furiously, sketching concepts, sourcing fabric swatches, building mood boards. Around 4 p.m., Georgia would emerge, glance at my work, and make cryptic statements like, "getting warmer," or "not quite what I'm seeing in my head." Then, miraculously, the next morning she'd have refined my concepts overnight. The designs would appear on her desk, altered just enough a sleeve shape changed, a hemline adjusted with her loopy signature at the bottom. "I had a breakthrough at 2 a.m., she'd say, not meeting my eyes. "Your ideas helped, Lindsay, but they needed my touch." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was Georgia Hall. I was nobody. But then came the Solstice collection, my first major project with the company. Georgia had been stressed about competition from younger designers. "They don't understand craftsmanship," she'd complained. "All shock value, no substance." In a moment of genuine collaboration, she'd asked for my perspective. I stayed late every night for 2 weeks, pouring everything I had into those designs' modern silhouettes with traditional hand embroidery techniques I'd learned from my grandmother. The collection was personal, a bridge between my heritage and contemporary fashion. When I presented my sketches, Georgia was uncharacteristically quiet. "Leave them," she finally said. "I need to think." The next morning, Women's Wear Daily announced Georgia Hall's groundbreaking new direction, a fusion of modern and traditional Asian techniques that would revolutionize how we think about cultural appreciation in fashion. My designs, my techniques, my story. But not my name, never my name. When the collection launched, Georgia gave interviews about her deep connection to Asian craftsmanship, about how she'd always been fascinated by the techniques. She even hired my grandmother to do some of the embroidery work, but introduced her as a local artisan I discovered. I confronted Georgia in her office, hands shaking. Those were my designs, my concepts, my cultural background. She looked genuinely confused, head tilted like a bird examining something curious. "Oh, Lindsay, don't be dramatic. We refined those together. That's how collaboration works." She patted my hand. "Besides, no one would care about these designs if they came from an unknown assistant. I'm giving your ideas a platform." I wanted to argue, but then she did something unexpected. She gave me a raise and a small credit in the show notes, special thanks to design team member Lindsay Kidman. Not quite a design credit, but more acknowledgement than most assistants get. "See," she said, "I take care of my people. Now, I need you to prepare for the resort collection. I'm thinking something with raffia this time." And just like that, I swallowed my objections. The raise would help with my student loans. The tiny credit might open doors someday. And maybe this was normal in the industry, paying dues, letting the established name take credit while learning the business. But it wasn't a one-time thing. Over the next 2 years, the pattern repeated with increasing boldness. Georgia would assign vague concepts. I would develop detailed designs, and she would present them as wholly her own after minimal tweaks. "Lindsay, darling," she'd say when I looked disappointed, "this is how it works. Chanel had assistants, Dior had teams. The visionary gets the credit. When you're running your own house someday, you'll do the same." But Georgia wasn't just taking credit, she was rewriting history. In interviews, she described her process in detail, the middle-of-the-night inspirations, the hand sketching, the personal connection to every piece, all lies. Meanwhile, the real work happened in the studio under my direction. Georgia's actual contributions, critiquing, complaining, and occasionally moving a button or changing a color when a design was nearly complete. "This blue is wrong," she'd declare, pointing at a finished sample. I specifically requested cerulean, not azure. She hadn't specified any shade of blue. I'd chosen it myself after 3 fabric stores and hours of deliberation. "The neckline is all wrong. How many times have I said I hate boat necks?" She'd never mentioned necklines at all in the brief. The gaslighting was constant. Georgia would change her mind and insist she'd been consistent all along. She'd claim ownership of ideas she'd initially rejected. She'd criticize me publicly but take credit privately. Worse, she cultivated an image of mentorship. I'm grooming Lindsay. She'd tell industry friends loudly enough for me to hear. Such raw talent, she just needs guidance. The fashion world ate it up. Georgia Hall, generous industry veteran, nurturing the next generation. Meanwhile, I was working 80-hour weeks, developing collections she couldn't possibly create herself. Watching my ideas walk runway after runway with her name attached. Why didn't I quit? The same reason most people stay in toxic situations, a mixture of hope, financial necessity, and eroded confidence. Georgia had a way of making me doubt myself, of making me feel simultaneously special and inadequate. No one else would give you this much creative input, she'd remind me. You're not ready to fly solo yet. And there was always a carrot dangling, a promised promotion, a future collection collaboration, a chance to travel to Paris Fashion Week next season. But everything changed the day I found the sketchbook. I was organizing Georgia's office during her 3-week inspiration trip to Bali, really a vacation with her married boyfriend, when I knocked over a stack of books behind her desk. As I gathered them, I noticed one didn't match the others, a simple black notebook without the ornate covers Georgia preferred for her public sketchbooks. I shouldn't have opened it. Professional boundaries and all that. But after 3 years of having my creativity stolen, curiosity overwhelmed ethics. Inside wasn't what I expected. Not Georgia's designs, but spreadsheets, contact information, payment records. She was selling designs, my designs, to competitors and overseas manufacturers. Concepts that had been rejected from our collections. Sketches that weren't quite right for the Georgia Hall brand. Technical specifications I'd spent weeks perfecting, all sold to fast fashion labels and mid-tier brands for substantial sums. My hands trembled as I flipped through page after page of transactions. This went beyond taking credit. This was theft, plain and simple. And it got worse. Tucked in the back was an email printout from Bernard Larson, CEO of Hall Design's parent company, Luxury Brand Holdings. It outlined concerns about the company's creative direction and mentioned an upcoming review of Georgia's position. Her handwritten notes in the margin made my blood run cold. Fire LC before review. Replace with Mia, more controllable. Claim performance issues. Copy shortcuts. Plagiarism accusation as backup plan. Delete her files, access first. LC, Lindsay Kidman, me. She was planning to fire me and potentially accuse me of plagiarism to protect herself from scrutiny. The woman who had built her recent success on my work was going to claim I was copying her. I closed the notebook with shaking hands and placed it exactly where I'd found it. Then I went to the bathroom and threw up. When I returned to my desk, an email was waiting from Human Resources requesting a meeting for my return to work review the day Georgia was due back. The termination was already in motion. I had 1 week to prepare. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call friends to vent or post cryptic messages on social media. Instead, I made a plan. First, I needed proof of my authorship. Georgia was careful. She'd made me use company equipment for all designs, kept originals locked in her office, and had me send everything through the company email system she controlled. But she didn't know about my process documentation. Since childhood, I'd kept detailed journals of my creative process, initial concepts, material explorations, technical challenges. My therapist had suggested I continue the practice to manage anxiety when I started working for Georgia. These notebooks contained dated entries for every major design I'd created, often with fabric swatches, reference images, and problem-solving notes that proved intimate knowledge only the true designer would have. I also had timestamps. Georgia might control the company email, but my personal Google account had dozens of notes to self, quick ideas or solutions I'd emailed while commuting or in bed that predated Georgia's middle-of-the-night inspirations. Next, I needed allies. This was trickier. Georgia had systematically isolated me from others in the industry, limiting my networking opportunities and keeping me too busy for industry events. But there were people who knew the truth, pattern makers who'd worked directly with me, fabric suppliers who'd seen my original sketches, models who'd heard Georgia fumble through technical explanations while I whispered corrections in her ear. Most wouldn't risk their careers to help me, but maybe not all. Finally, I needed leverage. The notebook with evidence of Georgia selling my designs was key, but I couldn't steal it. I needed access again, and proof that couldn't be disputed. I spent the weekend preparing, sleeping only a few hours. By Monday morning, I had the beginnings of a strategy. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. What I didn't have was Georgia's flair for dramatic timing, but sometimes the universe provides. Hey. Monday morning brought an unexpected email. Bernard Larson himself would be attending my review meeting. The company CEO never participated in assistant evaluations. Something bigger was happening. I arrived early, dressed in my most professional outfit, not one of Georgia's designs, but my own creation, simple, elegant, unmistakably mine. Georgia swept in 15 minutes late, Bali tan glowing, new highlights framing her face. She air-kissed Bernard and the HR director before noticing me. "Lindsay looking interesting today," she said, eyes narrowing at my outfit. Bernard gestured for everyone to sit. "Let's begin. I understand there are some performance concerns." Georgia launched into her prepared speech. "Regrettably, yes, Lindsay has been struggling to meet deadlines, and her recent work shows a concerning lack of originality. I've tried mentoring, but..." She continued weaving her fiction, painting me as increasingly incompetent despite her best efforts to develop my talent. The HR director nodded sympathetically, taking notes. Bernard looked thoughtful. "That's disappointing to hear, especially given the success of recent collections. Lindsay, what's your perspective?" Georgia's perfectly Botoxed forehead somehow still managed to wrinkle in alarm. This wasn't the script. Assistants didn't get to defend themselves. I took a deep breath. "Mr. Larson, before I respond, I have a question. How familiar are you with Georgia's design process?" Bernard looked confused. "I'm not involved in day-to-day creative matters, but I understand Georgia is hands-on with every design." "That's what I thought," I said. "Would it surprise you to learn that Georgia hasn't designed a collection herself in at least 3 years?" Georgia's laugh was brittle. "Bernard, this is absurd. Lindsay is clearly..." "Would it also surprise you?" I continued calmly. "To learn that Georgia has been selling rejected designs, my designs, to competitors." The room went silent. Georgia's face drained of color beneath her tan. "These are serious allegations," Bernard said finally. "Do you have any evidence?" I opened my portfolio. I have 3 years of process journals documenting every design in Georgia's recent collections, from concept to execution. I have time-stamped emails to myself that predate Georgia's claimed inspirations. I have testimonials from pattern makers and suppliers who work directly with me, not Georgia. I placed a USB drive on the table. And I have recordings of Georgia explicitly taking credit for my work in studio meetings, followed by her admitting privately that I did the actual designing. Georgia found her voice. "You recorded conversations without consent. That's illegal and completely unprofessional." "New York is a one-party consent state," I said. "And as for unprofessional, let's discuss this." I slid a photocopy of the notebook page with her plans to fire me and accused me of plagiarism across the table. Bernard picked it up, frowning. "Where did you get this?" "I found Georgia's notebook while organizing her office last week. Inside were records of her selling my designs to other companies, along with this plan to terminate me before your review of her position." Georgia stood abruptly. "This is preposterous, Bernard. She's obviously fabricated." "The notebook is still in your office, bottom shelf behind your design history books," I said quietly. "Unless you've moved it since returning from Bali." Bernard turned to the HR director. "Jean, would you mind checking Georgia's office?" "This is an invasion of privacy," Georgia protested, voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before. "You can't just rummage through my personal belongings." Bernard's expression hardened. "If the notebook doesn't exist, you have nothing to worry about." While we waited for Jean to return, Georgia's facade began to crack. Her leg bounced nervously. Her hands couldn't stay still. Bernard reviewed my documentation in silence, occasionally looking up at Georgia with an unreadable expression. "You were always jealous." Georgia finally hissed at me. "I gave you opportunities no one else would. I made your little designs marketable. Without me, you'd be nothing." I met her gaze steadily. "Without me, you'd have had nothing to show for the past 3 years." Jean returned, black notebook in hand. Bernard took it, Flipping to the pages I'd described, his expression darkened. Georgia, these payment records. You've been selling company intellectual property. Those were rejected concepts, she protested weakly. Unused materials. The company was done with them. That's not how intellectual property works, Bernard said. And these notes about firing Lindsay and accusing her of plagiarism. This is troubling, to say the least. Georgia changed tactics, her voice softening. Bernard, darling, this is all a misunderstanding. Lindsay is talented. Yes, but she's overlooking the collaborative nature of design. I provided the vision, the direction. The direction, I couldn't help interrupting. Like when you told me, make something blue, and then took credit for the entire evening wear collection. Or when you were so hungover that your only input was, whatever. Just make it sell for the resort line that got featured in Vogue. Bernard held up a hand. I've seen enough. Jean, please escort Georgia to the conference room. I need to speak with Lindsay alone. After they left, Bernard sighed heavily. How long has this been happening? Almost from the beginning, but it got worse over time, I admitted. The Solstice collection was the first one she took full credit for. He nodded. Our best-selling collection in years, and the subsequent lines that strengthened our market position all yours. I designed them. The team helped execute. Georgia mainly approved and did press. Bernard was quiet for a moment. Why come forward now? Not earlier. I pointed to the notebook. She was going to fire me today and potentially destroy my career with plagiarism accusations. I had no choice. I see. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully. Here's what's going to happen. Lindsay, I need you to prepare a comprehensive portfolio of your work, everything you can verify as yours. We'll need to determine what intellectual property belongs to whom. My heart sank. This sounded like we were both being pushed out. Am I being terminated? Bernard actually laughed. Terminated, Lindsay. I'm trying to figure out if I can promote you without creating a PR nightmare. Georgia Hall Designs can't exactly continue without a Georgia Hall, unless we address this very carefully. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meetings, legal consultations, and portfolio reviews. Georgia was placed on creative leave, essentially suspended while the company investigated. I worked with the legal team to document everything. From my original sketches to Georgia's sales of my work to competitors. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had Georgia been taking credit for my designs, but she'd been selling company intellectual property for personal profit, a clear violation of her contract. What surprised me most was how many people came forward once Georgia was gone. Assistants who had witnessed her taking credit for others' work. Executives who had questioned the disparity between her eloquent descriptions of the design process and her inability to answer basic technical questions. Even Georgia's former assistant shared stories of similar treatment. I was far from her only victim, just the most recent and most extensively plagiarized. 3 weeks after that fateful meeting, Bernard called me into his office. Georgia sat there, looking somehow smaller without her usual armor of designer clothes and excessive jewelry. Her lawyer sat beside her, face grim. Bernard got straight to the point. We've reached a resolution. Georgia will resign as creative director, citing a desire to pursue independent projects. The company will retain rights to the Georgia Hall brand name and all designs created during her employment. Georgia's lawyer added, Ms. Hall will receive a consulting fee for use of her name and will have no disparagement clauses on both sides. In other words, Georgia couldn't trash-talk the company or me. And we couldn't publicly reveal the truth about her design theft. She'd walk away with money and her reputation relatively intact. It felt anticlimactic. After years of theft and manipulation, Georgia would simply leave no public acknowledgement of what she'd done. No justice. Bernard seemed to read my thoughts. Lindsay, there's more. The board has reviewed your portfolio and contribution to the company's recent success. We'd like to offer you the position of creative director. I blinked. Of Georgia Hall Designs. Wouldn't that be confusing? Bernard smiled. We're announcing a sub-label Lindsay Kidman for Georgia Hall. Eventually, we'll transition to your name entirely. Your first official collection will debut at New York Fashion Week in September. Georgia made a small, choked sound but said nothing. Her lawyer whispered something to her, and she nodded stiffly. Additionally, Bernard continued, you'll receive back payments for all collections where we can verify your primary authorship, plus a signing bonus for the new position. The figure he named made me dizzy. It would clear my student loans and then some. One last thing, I said, finding my voice. I want design attribution protocols implemented. Every designer who contributes significantly to a collection gets credited, not just thanked in tiny print, but actually credited, no more invisible teams. Bernard hesitated, then nodded. That seems reasonable, given the circumstances. Georgia finally spoke, her voice tight. I built this brand. No one knew who Georgia Hall was before I made them care. You'll see how hard it is, Lindsay, when it's your name on everything, when every failure is yours alone. She stood abruptly. Are we finished here? After they left, Bernard turned to me. You realize what you're taking on. The press will be brutal. They'll question if you can maintain the brand's standards, if you're ready. I nodded. I've been ready. They just didn't know it was me all along. The 6 months that followed were the most challenging and rewarding of my career. I assembled a design team of talented but overlooked creators, implementing the attribution protocols I demanded. Every designer would get credit for their specific contributions, even as I provided the overall creative direction. My first official collection would make or break me. The fashion world was skeptical about Georgia's abrupt departure and my promotion. Rumors spread that Georgia had been forced out by corporate interests, that I had somehow manipulated my way into the position, that the collection would be a pale imitation of Georgia's genius. If only they knew. I decided not to play it safe. Instead of continuing the hall aesthetic, I created something unmistakably mine: architectural silhouettes with intricate details that honored my heritage while pushing technical boundaries. It was everything I'd wanted to design but had been forced to water down under Georgia's name. The night before New York Fashion Week, I could barely breathe. Tomorrow, for the first time, I would stand on that runway as myself. My name, my vision, my triumph, or my very public failure. What I didn't expect was Georgia's final move. She arrived at the show in her signature dramatic fashion, drawing photographers like moths to flame. The whispers spread immediately. Georgia Hall was here to witness her replacement's debut, obviously expecting disaster. I watched from backstage, heart pounding, as she took a front row seat next to the most influential critic in the industry, their heads bent together, Georgia gesturing animatedly as the critic nodded. She's trashing you before the show even starts, my assistant whispered. I should have been terrified. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. It doesn't matter. The clothes will speak for themselves. And they did. The moment the first model stepped onto the runway, the energy in the room shifted. This wasn't just another fashion show. This was a statement. Each piece told a story, my story. Finally, unfiltered. Technical perfection met emotional resonance. Traditional techniques met futuristic vision from my position backstage. I could see Georgia's expression change as the collection unfolded from smug anticipation of failure to confusion, then to something that looked almost like fear. By the final look, the audience was fully engaged, phones forgotten as they actually watched the clothes instead of recording for social media. When the full lineup returned for the finale, the applause was immediate and genuine. The moment had come for me to take my bow. I stepped onto the runway, wearing a piece from the collection, a structured jacket with hand-embroidered details that had taken weeks to perfect. The applause intensified. Front row critics stood, and there was Georgia, still seated, face frozen in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As I reached the end of the runway, I did something unexpected. I gestured to the side, bringing my entire design team out to join me, together. We took a bow, not just me as the figurehead, but everyone who had contributed their talents. The crowd loved it. In an industry built on singular genius myths, this transparent acknowledgement of collaboration felt revolutionary. As we returned backstage, triumph buzzing through us like electricity, I caught one last glimpse of Georgia. She was already heading toward the exit, shoulders hunched, typing furiously on her phone, Tomorrow's headlines were being written, and for once, she couldn't control the narrative. 3 years have passed since that night. Lindsay Kidman for Georgia Hall eventually became simply Lindsay Kidman. Though I kept some elements of the hall aesthetic as a bridge for loyal customers. The attribution protocols I implemented have spread to other houses, slowly changing industry standards. Young designers now have pathways to recognition that didn't exist before. Georgia. She launched a consulting business that quickly faded into obscurity when clients realized she couldn't actually deliver designs herself. Last I heard, she was writing a memoir about her time as a fashion visionary. I saw her once, about a year after my debut. We were both at a fabric fair in Milan. She was alone, looking at silk samples, when she spotted me surrounded by my team. Our eyes met briefly. I nodded politely. She turned away. Some might expect me to feel vindicated, seeing her diminished while my star rose. But what I felt was simpler relief. Relief that I no longer had to pretend, to smile while being robbed, to shrink myself to maintain someone else's illusion of greatness. The biggest revenge wasn't watching Georgia fall, it was finally allowing myself to rise. Sometimes at night, I still feel phantom anxiety, the instinctive fear that my sketches will disappear from my desk, that my ideas will be claimed by someone else. Old traumas leave marks, but then I remember where I am now, and the fear recedes. In my studio, every desk has a nameplate, every design has attribution tags, every team member knows their contribution matters. It's not perfect, nothing in fashion ever is, but it's honest. And when young designers ask me how I made it, I tell them the truth: success in this industry isn't just about talent or connections or luck. Sometimes it's about surviving long enough to be seen. Sometimes it's about documenting everything. And sometimes it's about finding the courage to say, "That's mine, I made that, and I won't let you take it from me again." The fashion world called Georgia Hall a visionary, but she couldn't see past her own insecurity. She built her name on stolen dreams, never realizing that true creativity can't be taken, only earned. My name is Lindsay Kidman. For years, my designs walked runways with someone else's name attached. But today, and every day forward, my work walks with the only name that matters: mine. If you've ever had your work stolen, your contributions minimized, or your talent exploited, remember this: documentation is power. Attribution matters. And sometimes, the most effective revenge isn't destroying someone else's castle, it's building your own, with foundations so strong they can never take it away from you again.